You know what term I don't like? Judeo-Christian. Leaving aside the fact that I've only ever heard it used by Christians to describe Christianity without risking overt offense to Jews, particularly in America, it strongly suggests that Judaism and Christianity have more in common with each other than they actually do, and implicitly that they have more in common with each other than either religion does with Islam. Now, this is going to sound subjective, but in my experience, most Jews I know, when given the choice, will agree that Judaism is more similar to Islam. In 2016, a professor at Wheaton College, a Christian university in Illinois, was fired for saying that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, on the grounds that Muslims don't believe in the Holy Trinity. But Jews don't believe in the Holy Trinity either, and I often wonder if she would have gotten fired for saying we believe in the same God. On that note, Judaism and Islam don't really have the Christian concept of faith in the sense of a willingness to believe. Emunah in Hebrew and both Iman and Itikad in Arabic are sometimes translated as faith, but they actually just mean belief. The idea of having a personal relationship with God that is influenced by worldly affairs is simply foreign. And frankly, if Jews lost the will to believe because bad things happened, this video series would have ended a long time ago. In the rare occasion that Jews or Muslims use the word faith when speaking English, it's more akin to loyalty to God. Hence in the Shahada, there is no God but God. And Judaism and Islam both command followers to express this loyalty mainly through ritual obligations. Islamic ritual is much simpler than Jewish ritual, but you can still see a lot of Jewish tradition reflected in the 5 pillars of Islam. And, like Judaism, Islam comes in a variety of flavors based on legal principles of jurisprudence instead of a central authority. In both religions, those who claim to be the central authority are decidedly self-appointed, and tend to have minimal recognition except maybe within their own country. But why should that be? Islam didn't grow out of Judaism the way Christianity did. Muhammad wasn't Jewish. So how did this happen? The first wave of Jewish settlement in Arabia came by way of trade caravans between Judea and what is now Yemen. During the Hasmonean period, one Jewish community even crossed the Gulf of Aden and settled permanently in Ethiopia, taking Amhara wives and founding the Beta Yisrael. And others had cut out the middleman of the Indian Ocean spice trade by settling in India. During the period of Roman and Persian hegemony over West Asia, Jewish merchants from Mesopotamia began settling permanently in the Arabian Peninsula, even adopting a tribal lifestyle and becoming the dominant population in certain cities and small kingdoms, like Himyar, a state which was ruled by Jewish converts throughout the 5th century, until it was conquered and extinguished by Aksum with support from Emperor Justinian. Other converts to Judaism included the Kinda, but the most powerful Jewish tribe on the peninsula by the 6th century were the descendants of those original traders, an offshoot of the priesthood called the Banu Qurayza, which controlled the city of Yathrib, better known today as Medina. We'll come back to them in a second. In the north of the peninsula, the dominant religion was Christianity, the most notable Christian tribes being the Roman-allied Assanids and the Persian-allied Lakhmids. That may sound strange considering that Christianity is almost non-existent in Arabia today, but in what will be a running theme throughout our discussion of the Middle Ages, the religion of a state often really meant the professed faith of its ruler, not the general public. And at the birth of Islam, religion in Arabia was as diverse and varied as it had once been in Rome. It also wasn't the same kind of Christianity as that preferred by the Roman Empire. The Assanids were Syriacs, which were Monophysites, and the Lakhmids were members of the Nestorian Church of the East. They were both Trinitarian, mind you, but their theological foundations put a lot more emphasis on Christ's humanity, which may have influenced Muhammad's conception of Jesus as, while not being an aspect of God himself, still a prophet and a Messiah. But why hear about Muhammad from me when you could hear it from YouTube's preeminent Muslim historian and a friend of the channel, Al-Muqaddimah?
Prophet Muhammad received revelation from the God of Abraham around 610 in Mecca, in modern-day Saudi Arabia. He began preaching the religion of Islam, which thinks of itself as a continuation of Christianity and Judaism. In fact, for the first 14 years, Muslims prayed facing Jerusalem. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was flown by God to Jerusalem, from where he ascended to the heavens and met God. Well, not exactly met God, but you know. However, Muhammad's teachings weren't popular and he was expelled from Mecca. he established a small state in the city of Medina to the north. Medina itself had quite a number of Jewish tribes living there, with whom Muhammad had a good relationship at first. He even told Muslims to fast on Yom Kippur. However, as he became more and more established as the head of Medina, he came into conflict with the local Jews, the most famous of which was against the Banu Qurayza. Keep it in mind that his conflict was with the Jewish tribes and not Judaism as a whole. The decision to execute all grown men of Banu Qurayza, which, while endorsed by Muhammad, was not actually his decision. It was made by a companion of his who had previously been an ally of the Banu Qurayza and a scholar of Jewish scripture. Then, in another political conflict, Muhammad marched his army towards a Jewish stronghold named Khaybar and conquered it. He also slowly allied with other Arab tribes around him and grew in power until eventually he even conquered Mecca. Muhammad passed away in 632, leaving behind the religion of Islam and a small community that ruled almost all of Arabia.
Thanks. Check out his channel. It's really great, and you'll like his videos if you like mine. Muhammad lived just long enough to see the end of the final Roman-Persian War. In the course of that conflict, Muslim forces had conquered the entire Arabian Peninsula, including huge amounts of Persian territory. After the war, Persia collapsed into political and military anarchy, but anticipating a joint Roman-Persian invasion of Arabia in retaliation for the loss of their hegemony in the region, Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, planned an invasion of Syria and Mesopotamia, though Abu Bakr himself would not live to see any of the actual fighting. By 634, Emperor Heraclius had somehow managed to make the religious tensions in the Roman Empire even worse. At the end of the final Persian War, he began pushing a doctrine called monothelitism, which dictated that Christ had two natures but only one divine will. I'm going to pretend for a moment that I know what that means, but the important part is that it was intended as a compromise between the Orthodox and Eastern churches that just ended up alienating both sides. Heraclius had also ordered the mass conversion of the empire's Jews for siding with the Persians 20 years earlier. Having fully lost the hearts and minds of the entire East, Rome at this point had no option of holding on to the Levant except by military force. And since the Roman army had all but destroyed itself over the previous 3 decades, I'm pretty sure a slight breeze could have captured it. Instead, they had to face off against Khalid ibn al-Walid, possibly the greatest general who ever lived. In 634, Khalid's forces conquered Mesopotamia so unexpectedly fast that the Muslims found themselves entering Syria from the north before the planned invasion from the south. Not that it mattered, as Heraclius himself got pretty well thrashed at the battles of Yarmouk and the Iron Bridge and basically resigned himself to never controlling the Holy Land again. With Palestine firmly under Muslim control, the Caliph Umar restored the Temple Mount, which since the final Roman-Persian War had been used as a garbage dump, and fulfilled the late Muhammad's dream of building the farthest mosque, or in Arabic, Al-Aqsa, on the site of the royal Stoa. For the moment, the foundation stone was left untouched. However, although Arab settlers had been migrating into the region since the Hellenistic period, the Caliphate now deliberately avoided resettling any lands west of the Jordan in order to keep the favor of those already living there, and Muslims remained a small minority in the province for about a generation. On general principle, Umar wanted to avoid conflict as much as possible with other religious groups he considered to worship the same God as Muslims, be they Christians, Jews, Samaritans, or even Zoroastrians. Non-Muslims would simply be required to pay an additional tax called jizya and refrain from proselytizing, which Jews and Samaritans didn't do anyway. And while there was never a formal pact with these groups, as later rulers and theologians would claim, Umar's policy of toleration set an important precedent called the Dhimma that would clear the path for even greater territorial expansion. However, Umar's prohibition against settling these newly acquired lands started to get cumbersome during the reign of his successor Uthman. Arabia's population was rapidly growing beyond what the desert environment could support. What's more, by the 650s, the conquests of Mesopotamia and Persia had resulted in a sizable population of subjects who were Muslims but not Arabs. And although the Caliphate officially considered all Muslims equal, not only were non-Arabs effectively excluded from power, but Uthman engaged in overwhelming favoritism toward his specific tribe, the Banu Umayyah. A civil war broke out over this, but the Banu Umayyah won, meaning that administration remained strictly Arab, and the needs of administration in the 8th century required the settlement of Arab bureaucrats in Palestine, particularly around the newly built provincial capital, Ramla. This period, which has come to be known as the Islamization of Palestine, culminated in 691 with the construction of the Dome of the Rock on the site of the Jewish temple. Why the Dome of the Rock was built is actually kind of a mystery. Yes, the foundation stone was the legendary site of Muhammad's night journey in the Quran, but that had already been sorted out with the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The best guess by historians today is that it was a power move. At the time, Mecca and Medina were under the control of a pretender to the caliphate named Abd Allah ibn al-Zubayr. Abd al-Malik probably wanted to show that he still had what it took to venerate God, and incidentally organized the necessary resources to build a big monument. And if that's what he was trying to do, it worked, because Zubayr and his movement were defeated the next year. You may also be interested to know that the shrine was originally white marble and that the dome was made out of wood, later replaced with blackened lead. It wasn't gold-plated until the 20th century. The rise of what we now call the Umayyad Caliphate ultimately created a lot of disharmony within the Muslim world, eventually leading to the schism between Sunni and Shia Islam. But if you were Jewish, life was markedly better under the Caliphate than it had been under Rome. It was no third temple, but it was a lot better than not existing. And it was the first time in centuries that Jews could not only access Jerusalem without restrictions, but actually live there. Because of this political union, this era of Judaism is known as Musta'arabi Judaism, or the Arabic Rite. As the vast majority of Jews now lived in the Caliphate, a new generation of prominent rabbis, known as the Gaonim, essentially did the same job as the Sanhedrin centuries earlier, using their knowledge of the Talmud to address questions from all over the Jewish world concerning the correct way to worship and keep the tradition. This would ultimately be the last hurrah for the Umayyad conquests. Although the Caliphate eventually did conquer the remainder of North Africa, enabling the establishment of yet another hugely important Jewish school at Kairouan, the native Berbers and Romans objected to the Umayyads' long-standing hypocrisy in supposedly offering equality to all Muslims while actually restricting power to fellow Arabs. Between 740 and 749, the North African provinces revolted, and it stuck. For the first time, there were Muslims living outside the Caliphate, and they quickly embraced a syncretic version of Islam that incorporated existing imagery from the local Berber religion and even some vestiges of Carthaginian paganism. This Carthaginian influence managed to find its way into the academy at Kairouan, giving us one of the rare symbols shared by both Judaism and Islam, the Khamsa. In Islam, the Hand of Fatima, as it's called, is a traditional image meant to ward off the evil eye. In Judaism, the Khamsa fit very well with existing biblical imagery revolving around God's protection, and became ubiquitous as a symbol to ward off evil. Today, it's arguably the symbol of religious Judaism, with the Star of David taking on a more secular cultural role. Soon, other non-Arab Muslims in the Caliphate quickly threw off the Umayyads' racist rule. The new Abbasid caliphs quickly turned their interest from conquest to knowledge, and the impact of this new wave of thought on Judaism would be unexpectedly transformative. Special thanks to my patrons, including my Gaonim, Lev Ham, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, Vicky Nelson, and Earl Weiss.